Hi everyone, this is Glenda Ganzon and welcome to my Human Anatomy and Physiology class. And for today's video, I'm going to discuss the parts of the central nervous system. So stay tuned. The brain and the spinal cord are the central nervous system, and they represent the main organs of the nervous system. The spinal cord is a single structure, whereas the adult brain is described in terms of four major regions: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. A person's conscious experiences are based on neural activity in the brain. The regulation of the homeostasis is governed by a specialized region in the brain. The coordination of reflexes depends on the integration of sensory and motor pathways in the spinal cord. So the iconic gray matter of the human brain, which appears to make up most of the mass of the brain, is the cerebrum. The wrinkled portion of the cerebral cortex and the rest of the structure is beneath the outer covering. There are large separation between the two sides of the cerebrum, which is called the longitudinal fissure. It separates the cerebrum into two distinct halves, a right and a left cerebral hemisphere. Deep within the cerebrum is the white matter of the corpus callosum, provides the major pathway for communication between the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. Many of the higher neurological functions, such as memory, emotion, consciousness, are the result of cerebral function. The complexity of the cerebrum is different across vertebrate species. The cerebrum of the most primitive vertebrates is not more or much more than the connection of the sense of smell. In mammals, the cerebrum comprises the outer gray matter that the cortex, which came from the Latin word meaning bark of a tree, and several deep nuclei that belong to three important functional groups. The basal nuclei are responsible for cognitive processing, the most important function being that associated with planning movements. The basal forebrain contains nuclei that are important in learning and memory, and the limbic cortex is the region of the vertebral cortex that is a part of the limbic system, which is a collection of structures involved in emotion, memory, and behavior. The cerebrum is covered by a continuous layer of gray matter that wraps around either side of the forebrain, the cerebral cortex. This thin, extensive region of wrinkled gray matter is responsible for the higher function of the nervous system. A gyrus is the ridge of one of those wrinkles, and a sulcus is the groove between the two gyri. The pattern of these folds of tissue indicates a specific region of the cerebral cortex. The head is limited by the size of the birth canal, and the brain must fit inside the cranial cavity of the skull. Extensive folding in the cerebral cortex enables more gray matter to fit into this limited space. If the gray matter of the cortex were peeled off of the cerebrum and laid out flat, its surface area would be roughly equal to 1 square meter. And the folding of the cortex maximizes the amount of gray matter in the cranial cavity. And during this embryonic development, as the telencephalon expands within the skull, the brain goes through a regular course of growth that results in everyone's brain having a similar pattern of folds. The surface of the brain can be mapped on the basis of the location of large gyri and sulci. Using these landmarks, the cortex can be separated into four major regions of lobes. The lateral sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the other regions is one such landmark. Superior to the lateral sulcus are the parietal lobe and frontal lobe, which are separated from each other by the central sulcus. The posterior region of the cortex is the occipital lobe, which has no obvious anatomical border between it and the parietal or temporal lobes on the lateral surface of the brain. And from the medial surface, an obvious landmark separating the parietal and occipital lobe is called the parieto-occipital sulcus. The fact that there is no obvious anatomical border between these lobes is consistent with the functions of these regions being interrelated. Different regions of the cerebral cortex can be associated with particular functions, a concept known as localization of function. In the early 1900s, a German neuroscientist named Corbinian Brodmann performed an extensive study of the microscopic anatomy, the cytoarchitecture of the cerebral cortex, and divided the cortex into 52 separate regions on the basis of the histology of the cortex. His work resulted in a system of classification known as the Brodmann's areas, which is still used today to describe the anatomical distinction within the cortex. The results from Brodmann's work on the anatomy align very well with the functional differences within the cortex. Areas 17 and 18 in the occipital lobe are responsible for primary visual perception. That visual information is complex, so it is processed in the temporal and parietal lobes as well. The temporal lobe is associated with primary auditory sensation, and this is known as the Brodmann's areas 41 and 42 in the superior temporal lobe. Because regions of the temporal lobe are part of the limbic system, memory is an important function associated with the lobe. Memory is essentially a sensory function. Memories are recalled sensations such as the smell of mom's baking or the sound of barking dog. Even memories of movement are really the memory of sensory feedback from those movements, such as stretching muscles or the movement of the skin around the joint. Structures in the temporal lobe are responsible for establishing long-term memory, but ultimate location of those memories is usually in the region in which the sensory perception was processed. The main sensation associated with the parietal lobe is somatosensation, meaning the general sensations associated with the body. Posterior to the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus, the primary somatosensory cortex, which is identified as Brodmann's areas 1 and 2 and 3. All of the tactile senses are processed in this area, including touch, pressure, tickle, pain, itch, and vibration, as well as more general senses of the body such as proprioception and kinesthesia, which are the senses of the body position and movement respectively. And anterior to the central sulcus is the frontal lobe, which is primarily associated with motor functions. The precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex. Cells from this region of the cerebral cortex are the upper motor neurons that instruct cells of the spinal cord to move skeletal muscles. And anterior to this region are a few areas that are associated with planned movements. The premotor area is responsible for thinking of a movement to be made. And the frontal eye fields are the important in eliciting eye movements and in attending to visual stimuli. Broca's area is responsible for the production of language or controlling movement, responsible for speech. In the vast majority of people, it is located only on the left side. Anterior to this region is the prefrontal lobe, which serves cognitive function that can be the basis of personality, short-term memory, and consciousness. The prefrontal lobotomy or lobotomy is an outdated mode of treatment for personality disorder or psychiatric conditions that profoundly affected the personality of the patient. Beneath the cerebral cortex are sets of nuclei known as subcortical nuclei that augment cortical processes. The nuclei of the basal forebrain serve as the primary location for acetylcholine production, which modulates the overall activity of the cortex, possibly leading to greater attention to sensory stimuli. Alzheimer's disease is associated with loss of neurons in the basal forebrain. The hippocampus and amygdala are medial lobe structures that, along with the adjacent cortex, are involved in long-term memory formation and emotional responses. The basal nuclei are a set of nuclei in the cerebrum responsible for comparing cortical processing with the general state of activity in the nervous system to influence the likelihood of movement taking place. For example, while a student is sitting in a classroom listening to a lecture, the basal nuclei will keep the urge to jump up and scream from actually happening. So the basal nuclei are also referred to as the basal ganglia, although that is potentially confusing because the term ganglia is typically used for peripheral structures. The major structures of the basal nuclei that control movement are the caudate, putamen, and Globus Pallidus. I'll repeat. The major structures of the basal nuclei that control movement are the caudate, putamen, and Globus Pallidus, and they're located deep in the cerebrum. The caudate is a long nucleus that follows the basic C shape of the cerebrum from the frontal lobe through the parietal and occipital lobes into the temporal lobe. The putamen is mostly deep in the anterior regions of the frontal and parietal lobes. Together, the caudate and putamen are called the striatum. The globus pallidus is a layered nucleus that lies just medial to the putamen, and they are called the lenticular nuclei because they look like a curved pieces fitting together like lenses. The globus pallidus has two subdivisions, the external and internal segments, which are lateral and medial respectively, and these nuclei are depicted in the frontal section of the brain. The basal nuclei in the cerebrum are connected with a few more nuclei in the brainstem that together act as a functional group that forms a motor pathway. Two streams of information processing take place in basal nuclei, and all input to the basal nuclei is from the cortex into the striatum. The direct pathway is the projection of axons from the striatum to the globus pallidus or GP1 globus pallidus internal segment, and the substantia nigra pars reticulata or SNR. The GP1 and SNR then projects to the thalamus, which project back to the cortex. The indirect pathway is the projection of the axons from the striatum to the globus pallidus external segment or GPE, then to the subthalamic nucleus or STN, and finally to the GPI and SNR. The two streams both target the GP1 SNR, but one has direct projection and the other goes through a few intervention or intervening nuclei. So the direct pathway causes the disinhibition of the thalamus or inhibition of one cell on a target cell that then inhibits the first cell, whereas the indirect pathway causes or reinforces the normal inhibition of the thalamus. The thalamus then can either excite the cortex as a result of the direct pathway or fail to excite the cortex as a result of the indirect pathway. The switch between the two pathways is the substantia nigra pars compacta, which projects the striatum and releases the neurotransmitter dopamine. So dopamine receptors are either excitatory or inhibitory. The direct pathway is activated by dopamine and the indirect pathway is inhibited by dopamine. So when the substantia nigra pars compacta is firing, it signals to the basal nuclei that the body is in an active state and movement will be more likely. So when the substantia nigra pars compacta is silent, the body is in a passive state and movement is inhibited. To illustrate the situation, while a student is sitting listening to the lecture, the substantia nigra pars compacta would be silent and the student less likely to get up and walk around. Likewise, while the professor is lecturing and walking around the front of the classroom, the professor's substantia nigra pars compacta would be active in keeping with this or her activity level. The diencephalon is the one region of the adult brain that retains its name from embryologic development. The etymology of the word diencephalon translates to through brain, and it is the connection between the cerebrum and the rest of the nervous system, with one exception. The rest of the brain, the spinal cord, and the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system, all send information to the cerebrum through the diencephalon. Output from the cerebrum passes through the diencephalon, and the single exception is the system associated with the olfaction, or the sense of smell, which connects directly with the cerebrum. In the earliest vertebrate species, the cerebrum was not much more than olfactory bulbs but received peripheral information about the chemical environment. To call it smell in this organism is imprecise because they live in the ocean. And the diencephalon is a deep beneath the cerebrum and constitutes the walls of the third ventricle. The diencephalon can be described as any region of the brain with thalamus in its name. The two major regions of the diencephalon are the thalamus itself and the hypothalamus. There are other structures such as the epithalamus, which contains the pineal gland, or the subthalamus, which includes the subthalamic nucleus that is a part of the basal nuclei. On the other hand, the thalamus is a collection of nuclei that relay information between the cerebral cortex and the periphery, spinal cord, or brainstem. All sensory information except for sense of smell passes through the thalamus before processing by the cortex, and axons from the peripheral sensory organs or intermediate nuclei synapse in the thalamus, and the thalamic neurons project directly to the cerebrum. It is a requisite synapse in the sensory pathway except for olfaction. The thalamus does not just pass the information on, it also processes that information. For example, the portion of the thalamus that receives visual information will influence what visual stimuli are important or what receives attention. The cerebrum also sends information down to the thalamus, which usually communicates motor commands, and this involves interaction with the cerebellum and other nuclei in the brainstem. The cerebrum interacts with the basal nuclei, which involves connections with the thalamus, and the primary output of the basal nuclei is to the thalamus, which relays that output to the cerebral cortex. And the cortex also sends information to the thalamus that will then influence the effects of the basal nuclei. Inferior and slightly anterior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus, the other major region of the diencephalon. The hypothalamus is a collection of nuclei that are largely involved in regulating homeostasis. The hypothalamus is the executive region in charge of the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system through its regulation of the anterior pituitary gland. Other parts of the hypothalamus are involved in memory and emotion as part of the limbic system. The midbrain and hindbrain, composed of the pons and the medulla, are collectively referred to as the brainstem. The structure emerges from the ventral surface of the forebrain as a tapering cone that connects the brain to the spinal cord. Attached to the brainstem, but considered a separate region of the adult brain, is the cerebellum. The midbrain coordinates sensory representation of the visual, auditory, and somatosensory perceptual spaces. The pons is the main connection with the cerebellum, and the pons and the medulla regulate several crucial functions, including the cardiovascular and respiratory system and rates. The cranial nerves connect through the brainstem and provide the brain with the sensory input and motor output associated with the head and neck, including most of the special senses. And the major ascending and descending pathways between the spinal cord and brain, specifically the cerebrum, pass through the brainstem. One of the original regions of the embryonic brain is the midbrain. It is a small region between the thalamus and pons. It is separated into the tectum and tegmentum from the Latin words for roof and floor, respectively. The Cerebral Aqueduct passes through the center of the midbrain such that these regions are the roof and floor of the canal. The tectum is composed of 4 bumps known as the colliculi, which is singular colliculus, and this means little hill in Latin. The inferior colliculus is the inferior pair of these enlargements and is part of the auditory brainstem pathway. Neurons of the inferior colliculus project to the thalamus, which then sends auditory information to the cerebrum for the conscious perception of sound. The superior colliculus is the superior pair and combines sensory information about visual space, auditory space, and somatosensory space. And activity in the superior colliculus is related to orienting the eyes to a sound or touch stimulus. And if you are walking along the sidewalk on campus, for example, and you hear chirping, the superior colliculus coordinates that information with your awareness of the visual location of the tree right above you. And that is the correlation of the auditory and visual maps. And if you suddenly feel something wet fall on your head, your superior colliculus integrates that with the auditory and visual maps, and you know that the chirping bird just relieved itself on you. And if you want to look up to see the culprit, but do not, the tegmentum is continuous with the gray matter of the rest of the brainstem, and throughout the midbrain, pons, and medulla, the tegmentum contains the nuclei that receive and send information through the cranial nerves, as well as regions that regulate important functions such as those of the cardiovascular and respiratory system. The word pons comes from the Latin word for bridge. It is visible on the anterior surface of the brainstem as the thick bundle or white matter attached to the cerebellum. The pons is the main connection between the cerebellum and the brainstem. The bridge-like white matter is only the anterior surface of the pons, and the gray matter beneath that is the continuation of the tegmentum from the midbrain. Gray matter in the tegmentum region of the pons contains neurons receiving descending input from the forebrain that is sent to the cerebellum. The medulla is the region known as the myelencephalon in the embryonic brain. The initial portion of the name myel refers to the significant white matter found in this region, specifically on its exterior, which is continuous with the white matter of the spinal cord. The tegmentum of the midbrain and pons continues into the medulla because this gray matter is responsible for processing cranial nerve information. A diffuse region of the gray matter throughout the brainstem, known as the reticular formation, is related to the sleep and wakefulness, such as general brain activity and attention. The cerebellum, as the name suggests, is the little brain. It is covered in gyri and sulci like the cerebellum and looks like a miniature version of that part of the brain. The cerebellum is largely responsible for comparing information from the cerebrum with sensory feedback from the periphery through the spinal cord, and it accounts for approximately 10% of the mass of the brain. Descending fibers from the cerebrum have branches that connects to neuron in the pons, and those neurons project into the cerebellum, providing a copy of motor commands sent to the spinal cord, and sensory information from the periphery, which enters through spinal or cranial nerves, is copied to nucleus in the medulla, known as the inferior olive. Fibers from the nucleus enter the cerebellum and are compared with the descending commands from the cerebrum. And if the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe sends a command down to the spinal cord to initiate walking, a copy of that instruction is sent to the cerebellum. Sensory feedback forms the muscles and joints. Proprioceptive information about the movements of walking and sensation of balance are sent to the cerebellum through the inferior olive, and cerebellum compares them. And if walking is not coordinated, perhaps because the ground is uneven or a strong wind is blowing, then the cerebellum sends out a corrective command to compensate for the difference between the original cortical command and the sensory feedback. And the output of the cerebellum is into the midbrain, which then sends a descending input to the spinal cord to correct the messages going to the skeletal muscles. The description of the central nervous system is concentrated in the structures of the brain, but the spinal cord is another major organ of the system, whereas the brain develops out of expansion of the neural tube into primary and then secondary vesicles. The spinal cord maintains the tube structure and is only specialized into certain regions. As the spinal cord continues to develop in the newborn, anatomical feature marks its surface, and the anterior midline is marked by the anterior median fissure, and the posterior midline is marked by the posterior median sulcus. Axons enter the posterior side through the dorsal or posterior nerve root, which marks the posterior or the posterolateral sulcus on either side. The axons emerging from the anterior side do so through the ventral or anterior nerve root. Note that it is common to see the terms dorsal, which means back, and ventral, which means belly, used interchangeably with posterior and anterior, particularly in reference to nerve and the structures of the spinal cord, and you should learn to be comfortable with both. And on the whole, the posterior regions are responsible for the sensory function and the anterior regions are associated with the motor functions. And this comes from the initial development of the spinal cord, which is divided into the basal plate and the alar plate. The basal plate is closest to the ventral midline of the neural tube, which will become the anterior face of the spinal cord and gives rise to the motor neurons. So the alar plate is on the dorsal side of the neural tube and give rise to the neurons that will receive sensory input from the periphery. And the length of the spinal cord is divided into regions that corresponds to the regions of the vertebral column. And the name of the spinal cord region corresponds to the level at which spinal nerves pass through the intervertebral foramina. Immediately adjacent to the brain stem is the cervical region, followed by the thoracic, then the lumbar, and finally the sacral region. The spinal cord is not the full length of the vertebral column because the spinal cord does not grow significantly longer after the second year, but the skeleton continues to grow. The nerves that emerge from the spinal cord pass through the intervertebral foramina or formina at the respective levels. And as the vertebral column grows, these nerves grow with it and result in a long bundle of nerves that resembles a horsetail and is named the coda equina. The sacral spinal cord is at the level of the upper lumbar vertebral bones. The spinal nerves extend from their various levels to the proper level of the vertebral column. In the cross-section, the gray matter of the spinal cord has the appearance of an ink blot test, with the spread of the gray matter on the side replicated on the other, or a shape reminiscent of a bulbous capital H, as shown in this picture. The gray matter is subdivided into regions that are referred to as horns. The posterior horn is responsible in the sensory processing. The anterior horn sends out motor signals to the skeletal muscles, and the lateral horn, which is only found in the thoracic, upper lumbar, and sacral region, is the central component of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Some of the largest neurons of the spinal cord are the multipolar motor neurons in the anterior horn. The fibers that cause contraction of the skeletal muscles are the axons of these neurons. And the motor neuron that causes contraction of the big toe, for example, is located in the sacral spinal cord. The axon that has to reach all the way to the belly of the muscle may be a meter in length. A neuronal cell body that maintains that long fiber must be quite large, possibly several hundred micrometers in diameter, making it one of the largest cells in the body. Just as the gray matter is separated into horns, the white matter of the spinal cord is separated into columns. Ascending tracts of nervous system fibers in these columns carry sensory information up to the brain, whereas descending tracts carry motor commands from the brain. Looking at the spinal cord longitudinally, the columns extend along its length as continuous bands of white matter, and between the two posterior horns of gray matter are the posterior columns. Between the two anterior horns and bounded by the axons of motor neurons emerging from the gray matter area are the anterior columns. The white matter on either or in either side of the spinal cord between the posterior horn and the axons of the anterior horn neurons are the lateral columns. The posterior columns are composed of axons of ascending tracts. The anterior and the lateral columns are composed of many different groups of axons of both ascending and descending tracts. the latter carrying motor commands down from the brain to the spinal cord to control output of the periphery. So this ends my discussion about the central nervous system, and if you have any question, please write it in the comment section down below. And if you're still not subscribed to my channel, please also do consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell so that you'll be updated with my new videos. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share. So once again, I would like to thank you all for watching this video and for listening to my discussion. Until the next one, bye everyone.